Over 300,000 years ago, a mysterious species of human was thriving in conditions so brutal, modern humans would not last a single winter. They made fire on purpose. They hunted cave bears. They wore jewelry and maybe even painted caves. These were the Neanderthals, and everything you thought you knew about them is probably wrong. Before we dive in, drop where you're watching from and what time it is. Love seeing how far these stories travel, and if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. See, for the longest time we had this image of Neanderthals as these dim-witted cave dwellers stumbling around Europe waiting to go extinct. The brutish caveman dragging his knuckles through the snow, too stupid to figure out how to stay warm. But recent discoveries have completely shattered that narrative. In late 2025, researchers confirmed something that changes everything we thought about early human intelligence. Neanderthals made fire on purpose 400,000 years ago. Now I know what you're thinking. Making fire is not that impressive, right? We've all seen survival shows where some guy rubs two sticks together. But here is why this discovery is absolutely massive. The evidence found at a site called Barnham in eastern England shows that Neanderthals were not just using fires that happened naturally from lightning strikes. They're so deliberately creating fire using a technique that required planning knowledge and skill. Archaeologists found fragments of iron pyrite at the site. Pyrite is that mineral some people call fool's gold because of its shiny appearance. When you strike pyrite against flint, it creates sparks, and those sparks can ignite dry tinder and start a fire. The Neanderthals at Barnham figured this out 400,000 years ago. That is 350,000 years earlier than the previous oldest evidence of deliberate fire-making anywhere in the world. One of the lead researchers called it the most exciting discovery of his 40-year career, and honestly, that is probably an understatement. But fire was just the beginning of how Neanderthals conquered the Ice Age, because staying warm required more than just flames, it required clothing. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Picture this. It is around 320,000 years ago, in what is now Germany. A group of early Neanderthals has just taken down a cave bear. These were not cute cuddly bears like you see at the zoo. Cave bears were absolutely massive, sometimes reaching over 3 meters in length and weighing more than any bear alive today. Taking one down required incredible coordination, courage, and some seriously impressive weapons. But here is the thing that surprised researchers. When they examined bear bones from the Schöningen archaeological site in Germany, they found something unexpected. The cut marks on the bones were not in the places you would expect if someone was just butchering the animal for meat. Instead, the marks were concentrated on the hands and feet of the bears, areas where there is almost no meat at all. So why would Neanderthals spend time carefully cutting around bear paws if they were not interested in eating them? The answer is fur. Those delicate, precise cut marks are evidence of meticulous skin stripping. The Neanderthals were removing the pelts from these massive bears and using them to stay warm during the brutal northern European winters. Now think about what that actually means. Bear skin has to be removed very quickly after the animal dies. Otherwise the hair falls out and the skin becomes useless. So these Neanderthals were not scavenging from carcasses they stumbled across. They were actively hunting adult bears and processing them immediately. That requires planning. That requires skill. That requires a level of intelligence that scientists refuse to attribute to Neanderthals for over a century. According to researchers, the use of bear skins was likely the key adaptation that allowed early humans to survive in the frozen north. Without those warm, insulating furs, the cold would have been simply too much to handle. A bear winter coat is made up of 2 layers. long outer hairs that create an airy protective barrier, and short, dense hairs underneath that provide incredible insulation. It is basically nature's perfect cold weather gear, and the Neanderthals figured out how to take that gear for themselves. But wait, there is more. Because the Schöningen site did not just give us evidence of bearskin clothing, it also produced something even more remarkable. The oldest complete wooden weapons ever found anywhere on the planet. 10 wooden spears dating back hundreds of thousands of years were discovered preserved in the waterlogged sediments of what was once a lakeside hunting ground. And these were not just sharpened sticks. These were carefully crafted precision weapons made by people who understood the properties of different types of wood and knew exactly how to shape them for maximum effectiveness. The spears were made primarily from spruce trees, with one made from pine. They vary in length from about 1.8 meters to 2.5 meters. The maker selected thin, straight trunks and stripped off the bark before shaping them into deadly hunting tools. The center of gravity on each spear is positioned about 1/3 of the way from the tip. Just like modern competitive javelins, that is not an accident. That is engineering. For decades, scientists believed these spears were around 400,000 years old, which would mean they were made by an earlier human species called Homo heidelbergensis. But in 2025, researchers used a new dating technique analyzing amino acids locked inside fossilized snail shells found in the same sediment layer as the spears. The results pushed the date much younger, around 200,000 years old, and that changes everything, because 200,000 years ago puts these weapons squarely in the time of Neanderthals. The implications are enormous. This was not some primitive scavenger species picking through carcasses left behind by other predators. The Neanderthals who made these spears were sophisticated hunters, capable of taking down the most dangerous animals in Ice Age Europe. Horses, deer, ancient rhinoceroses, even cave bears. The evidence shows they were hunting in coordinated groups, ambushing entire herds, and processing their kills with remarkable efficiency. One researcher put it this way: to achieve this level of routine success, these hunting expeditions must have been wholly collaborative and group-minded efforts motivated by a communal set of objectives. In other words, these Neanderthals were working as teams, communicating, planning, executing complex strategies together. That requires language, or at least something very close to it. See, this is the part that really gets me excited. For years, scientists argued about whether Neanderthals could talk. Some researchers claim they lack the vocal anatomy for complex speech. Others pointed to their isolated lifestyles as evidence that they did not need sophisticated communication. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story entirely. You cannot coordinate a group hunt against a herd of wild horses without some way of communicating your plan. You cannot teach someone how to select the right tree, make a spear, and balance it properly without passing along detailed information. You cannot maintain traditions that span thousands of years across different populations without some form of cultural transmission. The Neanderthals were not just surviving, they were building a civilization, a culture, a way of life that persisted for hundreds of thousands of years across an enormous geographic range from the Atlantic coast of Europe all the way to Central Asia. And speaking of culture, let me tell you about something that completely blew my mind when I first learned about it: eagle talon jewellery. In Croatia, at a site called Krapina, archaeologists discovered 8 white-tailed eagle talons that had been modified by Neanderthals around 130,000 years ago. These talons had cut marks where they had been separated from the bird's feet. They had polishing and abrasion marks from being strung together and rubbing against each other. and some of them had small notches cut in exactly the same place, suggesting they were all mounted together as part of a single piece of jewellery. This was not one talon worn as a simple pendant. This was an elaborate necklace or bracelet made from multiple eagle talons collected from at least 3 or 4 different birds over time. The Neanderthals hunted these massive eagles, removed their claws with precision tools, and assembled them into wearable art. Why would they do that? What possible survival advantage could eagle talon jewellery provide? The answer, of course, is that it provided no survival advantage at all. This was symbolic behaviour, personal ornamentation, a way of expressing identity status or group membership. The exact same reasons modern humans wear jewellery today. And here is what makes this even more remarkable. This jewellery predates the arrival of modern humans in Europe by tens of thousands of years. The Neanderthals did not learn this from us. They developed it entirely on their own. 30 years ago, scientists believed that only Homo sapiens exhibited symbolic behaviour. Neanderthals were thought to be completely different from us, incapable of art, incapable of abstract thinking, basically intelligent animals but not quite human. Now, we have little pieces of evidence that paint a completely different picture. Eagle talon jewellery, body paint made from red ochre, possible cave art, ritual burial practices. The Neanderthals were far more like us than anyone imagined. But if they were so smart, so capable, so well adapted to their environment, then why did they go extinct? Why did they disappear around 40,000 years ago while we survived and spread across the entire planet? That question has haunted scientists for decades, and the answers they have found are both fascinating and a little unsettling. Because it turns out the story of Neanderthal extinction involves climate catastrophe competition for resources and something else. Something darker that researchers just confirmed in late 2025, evidence of cannibalism, selective targeted cannibalism of outsiders. But before we get into that, we need to understand what made Neanderthals so perfectly designed for Ice Age survival in the first place. Because their bodies were not like ours. They were built different, literally engineered by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to withstand the most brutal cold conditions on Earth. And understanding that engineering is the key to understanding everything else about how they lived and ultimately how they died. The Neanderthal body was a masterpiece of cold weather adaptation. Short, stocky limbs, barrel-shaped chests, massive noses. Every feature served a purpose. Every trait helped them survive in conditions that would kill an unprotected modern human in hours. Scientists call it the hyperarctic physique, and the Neanderthals had perfected it long before the worst of the Ice Age even began. Think about it like this. Modern humans evolved in Africa, where the biggest temperature challenge was staying cool, not staying warm. Our bodies are designed to shed heat efficiently. Long limbs, lean builds. We are basically radiators walking around on 2 legs. Neanderthals were the opposite. They evolved in Europe during some of the coldest periods in recent geological history. Their bodies became compact heat-conserving machines. There is actually a scientific principle behind this called Bergmann's rule. It states that in cold climates, animals tend to evolve larger body masses and shorter limbs to minimize the surface area exposed to the cold. Neanderthals followed this rule perfectly. Their arms and legs were proportionally shorter than ours. Their torsos were wider and deeper. If you measured the ratio of body volume to surface area, Neanderthals would beat modern humans every single time when it comes to heat retention. But it was not just their overall shape. Even their faces were adapted for the cold. Those big Neanderthal noses that used to be mocked as primitive were actually brilliant pieces of biological engineering. The enlarged nasal passages warmed and humidified the frigid air before it reached the lungs. Breathing ice, cold, dry air directly into your lungs can cause serious damage. The Neanderthal nose solved that problem. Their enlarged infraorbital foramina, the holes in the cheekbones where blood vessels pass through, allowed for increased blood flow to the face, keeping the skin warmer in freezing temperatures. Even their massive brow ridges may have helped protect their eyes from the glare of sunlight reflecting off snow and ice. Every single feature of the classic Neanderthal face served a purpose. What early anthropologists interpreted as primitive or brutish was actually sophisticated adaptation to an extreme environment. And then there was their metabolism. Neanderthals burned calories at an absolutely incredible rate. Scientists estimate that a male Neanderthal needed somewhere between 4,500 and 6,750 calories per day just to maintain their body weight. That is more than double what a modern human typically needs. Even compared to today's hunter-gatherer populations, Neanderthals were off the charts. That kind of metabolic throughput was necessary because their bodies were essentially running internal furnaces around the clock. Keeping warm in sub-zero temperatures while hauling a stocky muscular frame across rugged terrain, chasing down megafauna requires enormous amounts of energy. Which brings us to the question of food. Where did all those calories come from? The answer is meat. Lots and lots of meat. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones shows that they got somewhere between 80 and 90% of their protein from animal sources. That puts them in the same category as wolves and hyenas in terms of their position on the food chain. They were apex predators, top of the pyramid. Everything from mammoths to woolly rhinoceroses to ancient horses was on the menu. The bone heaps found at Neanderthal campsites tell the story. Butchered remains of horses, reindeer, bison, and even the occasional mammoth. These were not scavengers picking through leftovers. These were hunters taking down the biggest and most dangerous animals in their world. And that required those weapons we talked about earlier. The wooden spears, the sophisticated hunting strategies, the coordinated group efforts that suggest language and planning and social organization far beyond what anyone expected from a species that was supposedly too primitive to compete with modern humans. But here is the twist. All of these incredible adaptations that made Neanderthals such successful Ice Age survivors may have also contained the seeds of their downfall, because being hyper-specialized for one particular environment can be dangerous when that environment starts to change. And change it did, multiple times, in ways that would test even the most well-adapted species to their absolute limits. So here is something that most people do not realize about the Ice Age. It was not just one long freeze. The climate during the time of the Neanderthals was absolutely insane. We're talking about wild swings between frozen wastelands and periods warm enough to support hippos swimming in the Thames River. Actual hippopotamuses in England. Let that sink in for a second. The last 800,000 years of Earth's history have been dominated by these massive cycles. Glacial periods where ice sheets spread down from the Arctic covering most of northern Europe. Then interglacial periods where everything thawed out and temperatures climbed back up. Back and forth. Over and over. Sometimes the transitions happened gradually over thousands of years. Other times the climate shifted dramatically within just a few generations. And the Neanderthals lived through all of it. Imagine what that must have been like. Your grandparents told stories about hunting reindeer across frozen tundra. But now the glaciers have retreated and forests are spreading north. The animals your people have hunted for generations are moving away following the cold. New species are showing up. The whole world your ancestors knew is transforming around you. This happened repeatedly throughout Neanderthal history. And somehow they kept adapting, they kept surviving. For over 300,000 years they rode these climate roller coasters better than almost any large mammal on the planet. But how? How do you survive when your entire environment keeps flipping upside down every few thousand years? The answer lies in something researchers call the refugia strategy. During the absolute worst of the glacial periods when ice sheets pushed deep into Europe and temperatures dropped to levels that would make modern Siberia feel tropical, the Neanderthals did not just tough it out in the frozen north. They retreated. They pulled back to warmer regions around the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula, southern France, Italy, the Balkans. These areas stayed relatively mild even during the harshest glacial peaks. And then when the climate warmed up again, they pushed back north following the retreating ice and the herds of animals that came with the warming temperatures. It was a rhythm, a dance with the glaciers that played out over hundreds of thousands of years. South when the cold came, north when it eased, generation after generation learning the routes, the timing, the skills needed for each environment. Now here is where things get really interesting. For a long time, scientists assumed that during the glacial periods the Neanderthals were barely hanging on, just scraping by in their Mediterranean refuges waiting for better times. The frozen periods were seen as population bottlenecks, where Neanderthal numbers crashed and they struggled to survive. But a discovery in Spain published in 2024 completely changed that picture. At a rock shelter called Abric Pizarro in the mountains of Catalonia, archaeologists found evidence of Neanderthal occupation during one of the nastiest cold snaps of the entire Ice Age. A period called Marine Isotope Stage 4, which lasted from around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago. This was brutal cold. Glaciers grinding south, temperatures plummeting. Most of Europe becoming uninhabitable. And what did they find at this site? Signs of Neanderthals barely surviving. Desperate people clinging to existence. Nope. Not even close. They found over 29,000 artifacts, stone tools, butchered animal bones, evidence of repeated long-term occupation. The Neanderthals at Abric Pizarro were not struggling. They were thriving, taking down both large prey like horses and deer, as well as smaller game like rabbits and birds. Exploiting every available food source with efficiency and skill. One of the lead researchers put it this way: the evidence shows behavioral plasticity and adaptability that allowed them to deal with harsh climate conditions without showing any major changes in their way of life. In other words, the cold did not break them. They just kept doing what Neanderthals do: hunting, processing hides, making tools, living their lives. The site sat in a landscape of evergreen oaks and Mediterranean vegetation, a pocket of relatively mild conditions surrounded by frozen wilderness, and the Neanderthals knew exactly how to exploit it. This is what 300,000 years of evolution and cultural knowledge looks like. The Neanderthals had survived so many of these climate swings that they had essentially written the playbook on Ice Age survival. When the cold came, they knew where to go. They knew what to hunt. They knew how to adapt their strategies to whatever the land offered. And they passed this knowledge down through the generations, parent to child, elder to youngster, accumulated wisdom about landscapes that their ancestors had walked for longer than our species has even existed. Speaking of knowledge being passed down, let me tell you about something that really shows how sophisticated these people were. The way they made their stone tools changed depending on where they lived and what they needed. In the frozen north, where large game dominated the landscape, Neanderthals favoured big, heavy tools, thick hand axes and scrapers designed for processing mammoth hides and breaking through the tough joints of massive animals. The tools were rugged, built to last through the demanding work of surviving in a land of giants. But down in the Mediterranean refuges, the toolkit shifted. Lighter, more refined points and blades appeared, tools better suited for taking down smaller, quicker prey. The technology adapted to the environment just like the people using it. This kind of regional variation used to puzzle researchers. If Neanderthals were just instinct-driven creatures following some genetic blueprint for tool-making, then their tools should look the same everywhere. But they do not. Different groups developed different techniques, different styles, different solutions to local problems. That is culture. That is learning. That is intelligence being applied to real-world challenges across vastly different environments. And the differences went beyond just tools. Recent analysis of Neanderthal remains from different regions shows distinct population clusters, groups that stayed relatively separate for thousands of years, developing their own physical characteristics and likely their own cultural traditions. There were Neanderthals adapted to the harsh conditions of the northern steppes, robust, heavily built populations that followed the mammoth herds across the frozen plains, and there were Neanderthals in the more temperate south, slightly different in build, hunting different prey, using slightly different techniques. It was not one monolithic population. It was a diverse species spread across an enormous range, developing local adaptations and traditions over hundreds of thousands of years. Tellingly, when scientists compared the genetics of Neanderthals from different time periods, they found something surprising. The species went through several near-extinction events, periods where the population crashed to dangerously low levels before recovering and spreading back across their range. The genetic diversity of late Neanderthals was remarkably low, much lower than you would expect for a species that had been around so long. It suggests that sometime around 100,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened. A population bottleneck that nearly wiped them out entirely, but they came back. They always came back. Whatever disaster struck the survivors picked up the pieces and rebuilt, recolonizing empty territories, re-establishing the old patterns of migration and hunting until they did not. Now, I know what you're thinking. If Neanderthals were so tough, so adaptable, so capable of surviving anything the Ice Age threw at them, then what finally did them in? Why are we here, and they are not? That question has generated more debate than almost any other topic in human evolution, and the answers are not simple, but here is what we do know. Around 50,000 years ago, something changed. Our species Homo sapiens started moving out of Africa and into the Middle East. Within 10,000 years we had spread across most of Eurasia, and within 10,000 years after that the Neanderthals were gone. Coincidence? Almost certainly not. The evidence suggests a period of overlap where both species occupied the same territories, sometimes literally the same caves separated by only a few generations of deposits. They knew about each other, they encountered each other, and based on the genetic evidence they did more than just encounter each other. Modern humans outside of Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. We interbred with them, not just once, but apparently over an extended period lasting thousands of years. Some researchers now believe the main pulse of interbreeding happened around 47,000 years ago and continued for roughly 7,000 years. These were not random isolated incidents. This was sustained contact between two very different but apparently compatible human species. The children of these unions survived and passed on their mixed heritage. Neanderthal genes spread through the expanding human population and persist in us today. So what did we get from them? What Neanderthal heritage is hiding inside your DNA right now? Quite a lot, actually. Genes involved in immune function, variants that affect skin and hair, genetic material that may have helped our ancestors adapt to the colder, darker environments of the north. Some researchers believe that Neanderthal genes helped early Europeans survive diseases they had never encountered before. But not all the genetic legacy is beneficial. Some Neanderthal variants have been linked to increased risk of certain diseases: depression, blood clots, skin conditions. The interbreeding was not entirely a win for us, and it definitely was not a win for them. Because despite the mixing, despite the cultural exchange, despite whatever relationship existed between our two species, the Neanderthals still disappeared. Some scientists point to the numbers game. Homo sapiens populations were simply larger and growing faster. We outcompeted them for resources not through any inherent superiority, but just through sheer demographic pressure. More mouths to feed meant more pressure on the same hunting grounds. And with climate getting more unstable than ever, the competition for dwindling resources may have tipped the balance. Others suggest we brought diseases that devastated Neanderthal populations. Our African origins had exposed us to pathogens that Neanderthal immune systems had never encountered. The same pattern that would repeat tens of thousands of years later when Europeans arrived in the Americas. And then there is the violence hypothesis, the idea that our ancestors actively hunted and killed Neanderthals. Warfare between species, genocide on a continental scale. There is no smoking gun for this theory, no mass graves filled with Neanderthal bodies showing signs of human weapons. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about events that happened 40,000 years ago. What we do have is indirect evidence of conflict, and we have that disturbing discovery I mentioned earlier, the cannibalism. In late 2025, researchers published analysis of Neanderthal remains from a cave in Belgium. Bones from 6 individuals, 4 adult females and 2 children, dated to between 45,000 and 41,000 years ago, right at the end of the Neanderthal era. The bones showed unmistakable signs of butchering, cut marks consistent with flesh removal, breaks consistent with marrow extraction, patterns identical to those seen on animal bones at the same site. These people had been eaten. But here is the disturbing part. Chemical analysis of the bones showed that these individuals were not local. They came from somewhere else. They were outsiders who had wandered into foreign territory. The researchers concluded this was not survival cannibalism, not a desperate act during starvation. This was targeted killing and consumption of people from other groups, outsiders being treated as prey. Was this a response to the pressure from encroaching humans? Were Neanderthal groups turning on each other as resources became scarce and territories shrank? Were the old patterns of cooperation breaking down as the world they knew collapsed around them? We cannot know for certain. The bones cannot tell us what was happening in the minds of the people who ate their fellow Neanderthals. But the timing is suggestive. This happened right at the end, right when everything was falling apart. The Neanderthals who had survived ice ages and climate shifts and 300,000 years of whatever the world threw at them finally met challenges they could not overcome. And in their final millennia, something dark emerged from the desperation. But even in their ending, they left us a gift. Their genes flowing into our ancestors ensured that in some sense they never truly went extinct. They live on in us, in our immune systems, in our skin, in the very fabric of who we are as a species. Every person with ancestry outside of Africa carries a piece of Neanderthal heritage, a tiny fragment of a species that conquered the Ice Age only to be swallowed by the march of history. What is remarkable is how much of that heritage actually proved useful. When researchers mapped out exactly which Neanderthal genes survived in modern populations, they found something interesting. The genes that stuck around were not random. They were disproportionately genes that helped with survival in cold northern climates, genes that affected fat metabolism and body temperature regulation, genes that influenced how the immune system responds to certain pathogens. Natural selection kept the useful Neanderthal variants and gradually eliminated the harmful ones. It is like our ancestors tried on Neanderthal genes for size and kept the ones that fit. Some of these genes are incredibly common in certain populations. Variants affecting skin pigmentation and hair texture that originated in Neanderthals can be found in the majority of Europeans and Asians today. We literally wear our Neanderthal heritage on our skin. Other Neanderthal genes have more complicated effects. There are variants linked to blood clotting that probably helped our ancestors survive injuries but may increase risk of stroke today. Genes that affect mood and pain sensitivity. Even genes that influence how our bodies process medications. The interbreeding was not a footnote to human evolution. It was a significant event that shaped who we are. We are not purely descended from those African Homo sapiens who migrated out 50,000 years ago. We are hybrids, a blend of our species and theirs mixed together and refined by tens of thousands of years of natural selection. In a very real sense, the Neanderthals did not go extinct. They merged with us, got absorbed into the expanding human population. Their bloodlines ended, but their genes persist. And speaking of that heritage, there is something else the Neanderthals left behind that scientists are only now beginning to understand. Something that suggests they may have been even more like us than anyone imagined. Evidence of ritual, evidence of belief, evidence that Neanderthals may have contemplated the same deep questions about life and death that have haunted our species since the beginning. Throughout Europe, archaeologists have found Neanderthal burials, bodies placed deliberately in graves, sometimes in curled positions reminiscent of sleep, sometimes with objects placed nearby, stone tools, animal bones, perhaps offerings for whatever came next. For decades, skeptics argued these were not real burials, just bodies that happened to get covered with sediment, random accumulations of objects, wishful thinking by researchers who wanted Neanderthals to be more human than they really were. But the evidence keeps piling up, site after site showing the same patterns, bodies positioned with apparent care, graves dug intentionally into cave floors, the deliberate arrangement of stones over remains. At one site in Iraq, called Shanidar Excavations, found multiple Neanderthal burials, including one famous case where pollen from wildflowers was found concentrated around the body. Did someone scatter flowers on the grave 70,000 years ago? The interpretation is controversial, but the possibility is haunting. Why would you bury your dead unless death meant something to you? Why would you take time from the endless work of survival to dig a hole and carefully place a body inside unless that body belonged to someone who mattered? Unless you believed in something beyond the simple fact that they were gone? We cannot know what Neanderthals believed. Their thoughts left no written record, but their actions suggest minds that grappled with the same mysteries we face. Where do we go when we die? Does consciousness simply end? Is there something more? Maybe they had answers. Maybe they had rituals and stories and beliefs that gave meaning to their lives and comfort in their deaths. Maybe around those fires they learned to make 400,000 years ago. They told tales of ancestors and spirits and worlds beyond this one. We will never know for certain, but the possibility alone forces us to reconsider everything we thought about what it means to be human. And then there is the cave art. Okay, so this is where things get really controversial. Like scientists yelling at each other at conferences controversial. Because if what some researchers claim is true, then Neanderthals were not just burying their dead and wearing jewellery. They were painting on cave walls tens of thousands of years before modern humans even showed up in Europe. In 2018, a team of researchers dropped a bombshell. They had used a new dating technique to analyse paintings in 3 Spanish caves: La Pasiega, Maltravieso, Ardales, red geometric shapes, hand stencils, abstract symbols painted on the walls in pigments made from crushed minerals. The dates came back at over 65,000 years old. That is 20,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, which means either modern humans got there way earlier than anyone thought or Neanderthals made those paintings. The research team went with option 2. They announced to the world that Neanderthals were cave artists, that our cousins had developed symbolic expression entirely on their own, without any influence from us. You can probably imagine how that went over. Some researchers celebrated the findings as confirmation of what they had suspected all along. Neanderthals were cognitively sophisticated, capable of abstract thought, creative beings who expressed themselves through art just like we do. Others were not so convinced. They attacked the dating methodology. They questioned whether the samples were really from the paint or from mineral deposits that formed later. They pointed out that the geometric shapes were pretty simple compared to the elaborate animal paintings at later sites. Maybe it was just random marking. Maybe it was not really art at all. The debate continues to this day. Every few months someone publishes a new paper, either supporting or challenging those original dates. Scientists love a good fight, and this one has all the ingredients. Revolutionary claims, methodological disputes, deep questions about what separates humans from everyone else. Here is my take on it. Even if those specific dates turn out to be wrong, the broader picture is becoming pretty clear. Neanderthals engaged in symbolic behaviour. The eagle talon jewellery, the ochre pigments found at dozens of sites, the careful burials, the flowers at Schöningen. All of this points to minds capable of thinking beyond the immediate, minds that created meaning and expressed identity. Whether they painted those specific caves or not, they were definitely doing something with pigments. Ochre shows up at Neanderthal sites across Europe going back hundreds of thousands of years. They collected it, they processed it, they used it for something. Body decoration seems like a pretty good guess. Try to picture it. A Neanderthal preparing for some important event, maybe a hunt, maybe a ritual, maybe something we cannot even imagine, grinding red ochre into powder, mixing it with animal fat, applying it to their skin in patterns that meant something to their people. Patterns that said, I belong here. I am one of you. I am ready. That is not the behaviour of a mindless brute. That is culture. But culture was not enough to save them. Because while the Neanderthals were doing whatever they were doing across Europe, another human species was getting ready to change the world. When Homo sapiens finally pushed into Neanderthal territory around 45,000 years ago, they brought something new. Not just better tools, though, they had those too. Not just different hunting strategies, though. Those were also part of the package. They brought networks. See, this is what a lot of people miss when they talk about why we survived and Neanderthals did not. It was not about intelligence. Neanderthals were plenty smart. They survived for 300,000 years in conditions that would have killed most species. Their brains were actually slightly larger than ours on average. No, the difference was in how we organized ourselves, how we connected with each other across vast distances. When archaeologists look at Homo sapiens sites from this period, they find something remarkable. Materials that came from hundreds of kilometers away, seashells from the coast found at inland sites, obsidian from volcanic regions traded far from its source, ornaments and tools made from materials that could only have been obtained through networks of exchange, spanning enormous territories. Neanderthal sites show almost nothing like this. Their tools were made from local materials, their ornaments came from nearby. They lived in smaller, more isolated groups connected to their immediate territory, but not plugged into anything larger. It is like the difference between a small town where everyone knows everyone and a city connected by highways and airports to the entire world. Both can work just fine under normal circumstances, but when things get difficult, having connections matters. Having people you can call on for help, having access to resources beyond your immediate reach, having information flowing in from distant places. When the climate started swinging wildly around 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens could adapt because they had options, trade routes, alliance networks, knowledge flowing between groups. If one area failed, they could move to another or get support from distant relatives. Neanderthals had none of that. When their local area failed, they had nowhere to go, no one to call, no network to catch them. And there was something else, something about how we innovated. Look at Neanderthal stone tools across their entire 300,000-year history, and you will notice something strange. They barely changed. The same basic techniques, the same general shapes, generation after generation making tools pretty much the same way their great-great-grandparents did. Homo sapiens tools evolved constantly. New techniques appearing and spreading, innovations building on innovations, stone points getting smaller and more refined, bone and antler being worked into new forms, composite tools with multiple components fitted together. Some researchers call this the ratchet effect. Each generation builds on what came before. Improvements accumulate over time. Technology advances not through individual genius, but through the collective tinkering of countless people across thousands of years. Neanderthals seem to have lacked this, not because they were stupid, but maybe because their smaller, more isolated groups could not sustain the same kind of cumulative innovation. Ideas need populations to spread through. Improvements need numbers to accumulate. A brilliant Neanderthal inventor could come up with something amazing, but if there was no network to spread that invention, it would die with them. We had the numbers, we had the connections, we had the ratchet, and we had something else that might have mattered even more. We could throw things really accurately. Okay, I know that sounds ridiculous. How could throwing be the key to human dominance? But hear me out. Those wooden spears the Neanderthals made at Schöningen and elsewhere, they were thrusting weapons, heavy enough to stab into a large animal from close range, effective but incredibly dangerous. You had to get right up next to a mammoth or a bison or a cave bear to use them. One wrong move and you were dead. Homo sapiens developed true projectile weapons, lighter spears designed to be thrown, spear throwers that extended the power of the human arm, later bows and arrows, weapons that let you kill from a distance, weapons that dramatically reduce the risk of hunting large dangerous prey. The skeletal evidence tells the story. Neanderthal bones are covered with healed fractures, especially on the upper body. The pattern matches what you see in rodeo riders who spend their lives getting thrown around by large angry animals. These were people who regularly got up close and personal with megafauna and paid the price for it. Homo sapiens bones show fewer of these injuries. We were killing from a distance, taking less damage, losing fewer hunters to accidents, which meant more surviving adults, more accumulated knowledge, more people to feed the network and keep the innovations flowing. It all connects. The networks fed the innovation, which improved the weapons, which reduced casualties, which grew the population, which expanded the networks. The Neanderthals never had a chance, and yet they held on. Longer than you might expect given all the disadvantages. For thousands of years after Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, the two species coexisted, sometimes in the same regions, sometimes literally in the same valleys separated by just a few generations of occupation. The end when it came was not sudden. It was a slow fade, a gradual retreat to the margins, Neanderthal populations shrinking and fragmenting while human populations grew and spread. The last holdouts were in the south, the Iberian Peninsula, those Mediterranean refuges that had sheltered Neanderthals during previous cold snaps. But this time there was no recovery, no pushback north when conditions improved. The territories they retreated to became their tombs, Gibraltar, that rocky peninsula at the southern tip of Spain, just 14 kilometers from Africa across the narrow strait. This is where the story ended. Gorham's cave sits at the base of the great limestone rock of Gibraltar. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals returned to this shelter. Generation after generation, they left behind hearths where they cooked their meals, stone tools, butchered animal bones, the debris of daily life accumulating in layers that archaeologists can read like the pages of a very long book. The latest Neanderthal layers at Gorham's cave date to around 32,000 years ago, maybe even more recently. Some controversial dates suggest occupation as late as 28,000 years ago, which would make this the absolute last Neanderthal site anywhere on Earth. Picture that. A small group huddled in a cave on the edge of a continent, the last of their kind anywhere. Behind them, the whole of Europe already taken over by the newcomers, ahead of them only the sea. Did they know they were the last? Did they have any sense that their people who had dominated Europe for hundreds of thousands of years were down to these final few individuals? Did stories survive about the vast territories their ancestors once roamed? Or had so much been lost that they thought this cave on this rock was all there ever was? We cannot know. The bones cannot tell us what they felt as the generations dwindled. The tools cannot reveal whether they understood what was happening. What the archaeology does show is that these final Neanderthals were still fully themselves, still hunting, still making tools, still living the way their ancestors had lived for millennia. They did not degenerate into some degraded remnant. They stayed Neanderthal right until the end. The cave shows evidence of marine resource exploitation, shellfish, fish, seals. The Gibraltar Neanderthals adapted their diet to include more coastal resources as they were pushed to the edge, still innovating, still responding to circumstances, still refusing to just give up and die. At the very end, they were burning fires and eating monk seals and looking out at the African coast across the strait. Maybe wondering if there was anywhere left to go. Maybe not thinking about it at all. Just living each day as it came the way their people always had. And then nothing. The hearths went cold. The tools stopped appearing in the sediment layers. The Neanderthals walked out of Gorham's cave one last time and never came back. For about 30,000 years after that final departure, only Homo sapiens walked the earth. We had the planet to ourselves. The last of the human experiments that had branched off over the previous million years were gone. Only we remained, or so we thought. Because here is the twist that nobody saw coming. In 2010, researchers announced the genome sequence of another archaic human species, one that nobody even knew existed until fragments of a finger bone were analysed from a cave in Siberia. The Denisovans, an entire branch of the human family tree that had lived across Asia, overlapping in time with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. A species known almost entirely from DNA because their physical remains are so fragmentary that we barely know what they looked like. And just like with Neanderthals, modern humans carry Denisovan DNA, especially populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania. Some groups carry as much as 5% Denisovan ancestry. We interbred with them too. The story's more complicated than anyone imagined. Not just Neanderthals and humans, but Denisovans and maybe other groups we've not even discovered yet. A tangled web of populations meeting and mixing and separating across hundreds of thousands of years. We are not the pure products of a single lineage. We are mongrels, hybrids carrying genetic material from multiple human species who walked very different paths to get here. The Neanderthals are part of that heritage, not just as a footnote or a curiosity, but as genuine ancestors. Their blood flows in our veins, their genes shape our bodies. Their story is our story, even if we only recently learned how to read it. And maybe that is the most important thing to understand about how Neanderthals survived the Ice Age. They did not just survive it, they mastered it. They developed technologies and strategies and maybe even beliefs that let them thrive in conditions that would crush most species. And then when they finally did disappear, they did not really go extinct. They became part of us, merged into the expanding human population, contributed to what we would eventually become. Every time you fight off an infection, your Neanderthal genes might be helping. Every time your skin responds to the cold, there might be a trace of their ancient adaptation. They live on in ways they never could have imagined, in billions of people spread across a planet they never got to see. That is not extinction. Not really. That is transformation. Evolution in a different form. The Neanderthal story continuing inside the human story forever. And here is something that might blow your mind a little. Those classic Neanderthal features everyone knows about. The heavy brow ridges, the sloping forehead, the massive face projecting forward. Those features were not ancient. They were derived, meaning they evolved over time. Early Neanderthals actually looked more modern than the late ones. If you compared a Neanderthal from 300,000 years ago to one from 40,000 years ago, the earlier one would have a flatter face, less pronounced brow ridges, a skull shape closer to ours. Over the course of their history, Neanderthal faces got more extreme, not less. They were evolving away from the ancestral condition while we were staying closer to it. So when people call Neanderthals primitive because of how they looked, they have got it exactly backwards. Those exaggerated features were the result of hundreds of thousands of years of specialized evolution. They were advanced in their own direction. Why did their faces change so dramatically? Nobody knows for sure. Diet probably played a role. Neanderthals used their front teeth as tools, clamping down on hides and materials with incredible force. That kind of repeated stress over generations could have selected for larger, more robust facial structures. Climate might have mattered too. Cold air and the need to warm it could have driven changes in nasal and sinus architecture. Whatever the cause, the result is clear. Late Neanderthals were highly specialized beings adapted to a very particular way of life in very particular conditions. That specialization served them well for a very long time, until it did not. There is a lesson in there somewhere about the dangers of over-adaptation, about how the same traits that make you perfectly suited for one environment can leave you vulnerable when that environment changes, about how flexibility and connection might matter more than raw capability when the world starts shifting under your feet. The Neanderthals could hunt mammoths with thrusting spears. They could survive winters that would kill us in days. They could make fire and craft tools and maybe even paint caves and definitely bury their dead with something like reverence. But they could not build the kind of sprawling, interconnected society that Homo sapiens stumbled into. They could not accumulate innovations across thousands of individuals spanning hundreds of kilometers. They could not respond to disaster by calling on distant allies for help. In the end, those differences mattered more than all their strength and skill and cold weather adaptation combined. The climate that finally pushed them over the edge was not even particularly severe by Ice Age standards. Around 40,000 years ago, temperatures fluctuated wildly. Warm spells followed by sudden cold snaps. Forests spreading and then retreating. Animal populations shifting unpredictably. It was chaos. And in chaos, networks beat isolation every time. The Neanderthals at Gibraltar watched the world change and did what they had always done. Adapted locally. Hunted what was available, retreated when necessary. But there was nowhere left to retreat to. No unexplored territory beyond the horizon. No distant cousins to merge with and rebuild. Just the sea, and across the sea, Africa, where Homo sapiens had come from, where the story had started for both lineages so many hundreds of thousands of years before. Maybe they looked across the strait on clear days and saw the mountains of Morocco rising in the distance. Just a few hours by boat if they had known how to build one. But they did not. The water was a wall they could not cross. And so they stayed in their cave and lived their lives and eventually faded away. The archaeological record shows no violence at the end, no dramatic last stand, just a slow tapering off. Fewer and fewer artifacts in each layer, longer gaps between occupations, until finally nothing at all. Silence for 30,000 years until archaeologists came with their trowels and brushes and careful measurements to read the story written in stone and bone and ash. And what a story it turned out to be. Not the tale of dim-witted brutes stumbling toward inevitable extinction, but the saga of a remarkable human species that conquered one of the harshest environments on Earth and held it for longer than we have even existed. They deserved better than the ending they got. But endings are rarely fair. And here is the strangest part of all. We're still finding them. Still learning things that overturn everything we thought we knew. Just when scientists think they have the Neanderthal story figured out, someone digs up something that forces everyone to start over. New sites, new bones, new techniques that can extract information from fragments that would have been useless 10 years ago. The Neanderthals have been dead for 30,000 years, but their secrets are still coming out. Drip by drip, discovery by discovery. And some of what we are learning is absolutely wild. So let me tell you about some of the strangest things we've discovered. Because researchers keep finding stuff that completely rewrites the story. Every year brings new evidence that forces scientists to throw out what they thought they knew and start over. Take the diet question. I told you earlier that Neanderthals were hardcore meat eaters, top of the food chain, wolves with spears basically. And that is true. Chemical analysis of their bones confirms it beyond any reasonable doubt. But there is a problem. When researchers looked at the nitrogen levels in Neanderthal remains, they found something weird. The numbers were off the charts, higher than wolves, higher than hyenas, higher than any predator that has ever been tested. Now, nitrogen levels tell you where an animal sits on the food chain. Plants have low nitrogen. Herbivores that eat plants have slightly more. Predators that eat herbivores have even more. And predators that eat other predators have the highest levels of all. So what were Neanderthals eating that pushed their nitrogen so ridiculously high? They were not hunting lions. They were not eating wolves. The numbers did not make sense. For years, this was one of those nagging puzzles that researchers could not quite crack. Until someone came up with a theory so bizarre it just might be right. Maggots. Yeah, you heard that correctly. A study published in 2025 suggested that the super high nitrogen levels might come from eating meat that had been stored long enough to develop fly larvae. In other words, Neanderthals may have been aging their meat, letting it hang until it got a little funky, and then eating the maggots along with everything else. Sounds disgusting, right? But think about it for a second. If you have just killed a mammoth, you have way more meat than your group can eat before it goes bad. You have two choices. Let it rot and waste all that precious protein, or find a way to preserve it and stretch those calories across weeks instead of days. Lots of traditional cultures around the world ate aged meat and the larvae that came with it. It is actually a pretty efficient way to extract every possible calorie from a kill. Nothing goes to waste. The maggots themselves are packed with protein and fat, and the fermentation process might even make some nutrients more available. Were Neanderthals really doing this? We cannot prove it yet, but the nitrogen numbers fit, and it would explain how small groups managed to survive in environments where big kills were rare and every calorie counted. Speaking of survival, there is something else we're only starting to understand: how Neanderthal children grew up. And it turns out they had childhoods very different from ours. When researchers examined the teeth of young Neanderthals, they found growth patterns that tell a remarkable story. Neanderthal kids grew up fast, really fast. Their teeth developed more quickly than ours. Their bodies matured earlier. A Neanderthal teenager was probably physically adult by an age when modern human kids are still figuring out middle school. Why the rush? Probably because the world they lived in did not give them the luxury of extended childhood. Every winter was a survival crisis. Every hunt was a test. The faster you could contribute to the group, the better your chances of making it through. Modern humans took a different path. We extended childhood, gave our young more time to learn, more time to absorb the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. It is a riskier strategy in some ways because children are dependent longer and drain resources without contributing much. But it also means more time to master complex skills and build the kind of cultural knowledge that accumulates over generations. This might be another piece of the puzzle when it comes to why we are here and they are not. Our kids had more time to learn, more time to absorb those innovations and social networks that gave us our edge. Neanderthal children had to grow up fast and get to work. Neither strategy is inherently better. They just fit different circumstances. In the brutal world of Ice Age Europe, where adult strength meant the difference between eating and starving, the Neanderthal approach made sense. But when circumstances changed, it may have left them less able to adapt. Now let me address something that comes up constantly when people talk about Neanderthals. Could they speak? Did they have language? This one drives scientists crazy because we cannot just go back in time and listen to them talk. We have to work from indirect evidence, and that evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. On one hand, we have anatomy. For a long time, researchers pointed to the position of the Neanderthal voice box as evidence they could not produce the full range of human sounds. Their throats were supposedly shaped wrong for complex speech. But then someone found a Neanderthal hyoid bone. That is the little horseshoe-shaped bone in your throat that supports the tongue and helps produce speech sounds. And guess what? It looked basically identical to ours. Same shape, same structure, same muscle attachment points. That does not prove Neanderthals could talk, but it removes one of the main anatomical arguments against it. Then there is genetics. Neanderthals carried a version of the FOXP2 gene that is associated with language ability in modern humans. When this gene is damaged, people have severe speech problems. Neanderthals had the same working version we do. Again, not proof, but another piece of evidence suggesting the potential was there. And then there is the behavioural evidence we've already talked about. Coordinated group hunts, complex tool traditions passed across generations, symbolic behaviour like jewellery and burial practices. All of this seems to require some way of communicating complicated ideas. Could they hold a philosophical conversation? Probably not in the way we would recognise. But could they coordinate a mammoth hunt? Teach a child to make a proper spear? Pass along the location of good hunting grounds and water sources? Share stories about ancestors and spirits? I think yes. Maybe not with the grammatical complexity we're used to, but something. Some form of communication sophisticated enough to maintain cultures that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. And while we are on the topic of what Neanderthals could do, let me tell you about their physical capabilities. Because honestly, modern humans would get absolutely destroyed in any kind of physical competition with these guys. The muscle attachment points on Neanderthal bones tell the story. Massive ridges and bumps where huge muscles connected to the skeleton, arms that could generate far more force than any human athlete today. Grip strength that would make a professional arm wrestler look like a child. One researcher estimated that an average Neanderthal woman was probably stronger than virtually any human man alive today. Not stronger than Olympic weightlifters after years of training. Stronger than almost all normal men. That was just baseline Neanderthal strength with no special training at all. This was not about being bulky bodybuilder types. It was about genuine functional power built into their bodies from birth. The kind of strength you need when your survival depends on wrestling dangerous animals into submission and hauling heavy carcasses across frozen landscapes. Their bones were denser than ours too, thicker, harder to break, built to handle the stresses of lives spent doing incredibly demanding physical work without the benefit of machines or even domesticated animals to help. When Neanderthals hunted with those thrusting spears getting right up next to bison and mammoths and cave bears, they needed every bit of that strength. One wrong move could mean a horn through the chest or a claw across the face. Only raw power and incredible reflexes kept them alive long enough to reproduce. The injuries on their skeletons prove how dangerous their lives were. Healed fractures everywhere, especially on the upper body and head. The pattern matches people who spent their lives in close combat with large, angry animals, getting thrown, getting trampled, getting gored, surviving through sheer toughness and getting back up to do it again. That life took a toll. Neanderthals rarely lived past 40, not because of some genetic limitation, but because the accumulated damage of decades of brutal physical existence simply added up. Their bodies were incredible machines, but even the best machine wears out eventually. Now what about their minds? We have talked a lot about Neanderthal intelligence, but let me get specific about their brains. Neanderthal brains were actually slightly larger than ours on average. When you measure cranial capacity, they come out ahead. For a long time, people used this to argue that brain size does not matter, or that Neanderthals must have been stupid despite having big brains. But the story's more complicated than that. Brain size is not the only thing that matters. Structure matters too. And Neanderthal brains were structured differently than ours. The parts of the brain dedicated to vision and body control were proportionally larger in Neanderthals. Makes sense when you think about it. They needed incredible visual acuity for tracking prey across vast landscapes. They needed precise body control for the demands of hunting and survival. Evolution invested neural resources in those areas. Our brains went a different direction. The parts associated with social cognition and language processing are proportionally larger in modern humans. We invested in the wetware needed to manage larger social networks, to process more complex linguistic information, to keep track of relationships and alliances across bigger groups. Neither design is objectively better. They're just optimized for different things. Neanderthal brains were tuned for the demands of small group survival in harsh environments. Our brains were tuned for navigating complex social worlds with lots of moving parts. But do not let anyone tell you Neanderthal brains could not handle complex tasks. The evidence says otherwise. Take their stone tools. I have mentioned these before, but let me tell you what it actually took to make one. Because it was not just picking up a rock and smashing it against another rock until something sharp fell off. Neanderthals used a technique that modern researchers call prepared core technology. You start with a large nodule of good quality stone. Flint works best, but they used whatever was available. Then you carefully shape that nodule, working around the entire surface, removing small flakes in a specific pattern. You're not making a tool yet. You're preparing the core, setting it up so that with one final precise strike, you can remove a single perfect flake exactly the shape and size you need. The preparation might take dozens of carefully placed blows. Each one has to be just right or you ruin the whole thing. Too hard and the core shatters. Wrong angle and the flake comes off crooked. Every strike requires judging the stone, reading its internal structure, predicting how force will travel through the material. And here is the thing. You cannot see inside the rock. You have to feel it, sense it, know from experience and practice exactly how this particular piece of flint is going to behave. Modern experimenters who try to replicate Neanderthal tools spend years learning the craft. Some never get very good at it. These were not simple skills that anyone could pick up. They required serious cognitive ability and incredible hand-eye coordination. So when people talk about Neanderthals as dim or primitive, because they did not leave behind cave paintings or bone flutes, I want to hand them a nodule of flint and say, okay, show me what you can do with this. I guarantee they would produce garbage while a Neanderthal child could outperform them after a few lessons. And here is something fascinating that researchers are just starting to figure out. Those Neanderthal genes floating around in modern human DNA might still be affecting how our brains work today. There are studies suggesting that certain Neanderthal gene variants influence brain development and structure in people who carry them. Some of these effects are subtle, changes in the shape of certain brain regions, differences in how neural connections form. We do not fully understand what it all means yet, but the research is ongoing. Other Neanderthal genes have more obvious effects on modern health. Variants that increase risk of blood clots made sense in a world where injuries were common and you needed your blood to clump quickly to survive a wound. But in the modern world where we're not getting gored by aurochs, Those same variants just increase our risk of stroke and heart attack. There are Neanderthal gene variants linked to depression, to certain autoimmune conditions, to how our skin responds to sunlight. Some researchers have even found connections to how we process pain and respond to certain medications. The medical implications are still being worked out. But the bottom line is clear. The interbreeding that happened 40-something thousand years ago is not just ancient history. It is actively affecting human health and biology right now. Your doctor might someday need to know about your Neanderthal heritage to give you the best treatment. Which brings up a question that some people find uncomfortable. If Neanderthal genes are causing problems for modern humans, should we try to edit them out? Should we use genetic technology to remove variants that increase disease risk? The flip side is just as interesting. Should we try to bring Neanderthals back? We have their DNA. We have increasingly sophisticated genetic engineering tools. Some scientists have seriously proposed reconstructing the Neanderthal genome and using it to create living individuals, not through some Jurassic Park-style resurrection, but through gradual genetic modification of human cells until you have something that is essentially Neanderthal. Is that a good idea? Would it be ethical? What rights would such a being have? Would they be human? Would they be something else? These are not just science fiction questions anymore. The technology is advancing fast enough that we might actually face these choices within a few decades. What we decide will say a lot about who we are and what we think about our extinct relatives. For now, though, we can only learn from what they left behind. The bones, the tools, the traces of meals and fires and lives lived tens of thousands of years before anyone was writing things down. Every new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. Every analysis reveals something we did not know before. But there is one question that all of this research keeps circling back to. One mystery that haunts everyone who studies these ancient people. What did they think of us? We spend so much time asking what we thought of them, whether we saw them as enemies or competitors or mates, how we outcompeted them, why we survived and they did not. But nobody ever flips the question. Nobody asks what it was like from their side, what the Neanderthals felt when strange thin people from the south started appearing in their world, what they thought as their territory shrank and their numbers dwindled and everything they knew began to disappear. That question keeps me up at night sometimes. Picture this moment. Somewhere in Europe, maybe 45,000 years ago, a group of Homo sapiens pushing into new territory, following a river valley north, tracking horses across unfamiliar grassland. They have been walking for generations. Their ancestors pushed out of Africa and through the Middle East, and now they're here in this cold, strange land. And then they see them. Figures on a ridgeline, human-shaped but wrong somehow. Stockier, moving differently, watching with eyes that gleam with unmistakable intelligence. What happened next? Did they wave? Did they run? Did someone raise a weapon while another held up a hand for peace? We will never know. But that moment happened, and it happened hundreds of times across thousands of years as the two species encountered each other throughout Eurasia. But here is what nobody ever talks about. What did the Neanderthals think when they saw us? These were people whose ancestors had owned Europe for 300,000 years, whose grandparents, going back further than memory could stretch, had walked these valleys and hunted these herds. This was their world. And then we showed up. Strange thin people from somewhere else, making weird sounds, using different tools, travelling in groups so large they sprawled across the landscape like a slow-moving flood. How did that feel, watching us spread year after year? watching the game get scarcer, finding your hunting grounds taken by strangers who refused to leave. Did they fight back? Did some groups try to make peace while others chose war? Did elders hold councils to debate what to do? Did parents hold their children at night wondering what kind of world those children would inherit? All of that is gone, vanished into silence. We have their bones, but not their stories. Their tools, but not their fears. Their genes, but not their dreams. And that is what extinction really means. Not just death, but erasure. An entire universe of experience simply gone. But here is where things get strange. Because the more we learn about Neanderthals, the more we learn about ourselves. And some of what we're discovering is completely upending how we think about human evolution. Let me tell you about a skull found in Germany back in 1933, near a town called Steinheim, about 300 kilometers south of the Schöningen spear site. Workers at a gravel pit pulled it out of the ground, and nobody knew quite what to make of it. The Steinheim skull is one of the weirdest fossils in the entire human family tree. It is somewhere between 250,000 and 350,000 years old, and it looks like it could not decide what species it wanted to be. On one hand, it has a big bulge at the back of the head called an occipital bun. That is classic Neanderthal, a feature you see on almost every Neanderthal skull ever found. But then you look at the face and something is off. The face is flatter than it should be, more delicate, more like a modern human than a Neanderthal. For decades, scientists argued about what to do with this thing. Some said it was an early Neanderthal. Others said it was our ancestor Homo heidelbergensis. Some wanted to create a whole new species just for this one skull. And here is the twist that blew my mind when I first learned about it. Recent analysis suggests that the Steinheim skull might show us what Neanderthals looked like before they became fully Neanderthal. A snapshot of evolution in progress. Remember those classic Neanderthal features, the heavy brow ridges, the projecting face, the sloping forehead. Everyone assumes those are primitive traits, holdovers from some ancient ancestor, signs that Neanderthals were less evolved than us. Completely wrong. Those features evolved over time. Early Neanderthals had flatter faces, less pronounced brows, skulls that looked more like ours. Over 300,000 years, their faces got more extreme, not less. They were evolving away from the ancestral condition while we stayed closer to it. So when people call Neanderthals primitive because of how they looked, they have it exactly backwards. Those exaggerated features were advanced, specialized, the result of hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation to a very particular way of life. There is an even weirder implication. A much older fossil called Homo antecessor from about 800,000 years ago has a surprisingly modern-looking face, almost like ours, which suggests that the modern human face might actually be ancient, a feature that has appeared and disappeared multiple times in our evolutionary history. We did not evolve modern faces, we kept them. The Neanderthals are the ones who changed. But the story gets stranger still, because the family tree we thought we understood keeps getting more tangled every time someone sequences another ancient genome. In 2010, scientists announced they had recovered DNA from a tiny finger bone found in a Siberian cave called Denisova. Everyone expected it to be Neanderthal. The cave had Neanderthal tools, the region had Neanderthal sites. But the DNA told a different story. This was something new, an entire branch of the human family that nobody knew existed. They called them Denisovans after the cave where the bone was found. We still barely know what Denisovans looked like. Almost all we have is DNA. But that DNA tells us they lived across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, overlapping with both Neanderthals and us. And just like with Neanderthals, we interbred with them. Modern populations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. That is even more than most people carry from Neanderthals. These were not random encounters. This was sustained contact between multiple human species over thousands of years. And it gets even more complicated. The Denisovan genome contains traces of DNA from yet another unknown population, something that split off from the human family tree over 1 million years ago. A ghost lineage that we have never found bones for. We only know it exists because echoes of its DNA survived inside the Denisovans who interbred with it. How many human species were there? How many branches of the family tree have we lost to time? How many encounters between different kinds of people happened in the depths of prehistory that we will never know about? The old picture of human evolution was simple, a straight line from apes to us, each species replacing the last, neat and clean and wrong. The real picture is a tangled bush, branches splitting and merging and splitting again, populations meeting and mixing and separating, genes flowing between groups that scientists used to think were completely separate species. We're not the product of a single lineage. We are a remix, a mashup of multiple human experiments blended together by thousands of years of interbreeding. And here is why this matters for you personally. Those ancient genes are not just curiosities. They are active, functional, doing things in your body right now. There is a Neanderthal gene variant that affects how your immune system recognizes certain viruses. If you carry it, you might respond differently to infections than someone who does not. There are variants that influence blood clotting and pain perception, and how your skin handles sunlight. Variants linked to depression and autoimmune conditions, and even how you metabolize certain medications. Doctors are starting to realize they might need to consider your Neanderthal heritage when deciding how to treat you. The interbreeding that happened 47,000 years ago could affect which drugs work best for you today. That is not ancient history. That is your medical file. And the genes do not just affect health. There are studies showing Neanderthal variants influence brain development, the shape of certain brain regions, how neurons connect. We do not understand what it all means yet, but the research is clear. Neanderthal DNA is doing something in there. When you think a thought, any thought, some tiny fraction of the machinery running that process might have been inherited from people who died 30,000 years before writing was invented. That is honestly terrifying if you think about it too hard. Or maybe beautiful. Maybe both. Look, I could go on all day about the science. The discoveries keep coming faster than anyone can process them. Every year brings new sites, new bones, new genomes, new revelations. The Neanderthal story that scientists are telling today is completely different from the one they told 10 years ago. And 10 years from now it will be different again. But here is what I keep coming back to. What I cannot stop thinking about. Somewhere right now in a museum storage room there is probably a bone or a tooth or a fragment of skull that nobody has analyzed yet. Something pulled from the ground decades ago and filed away and forgotten. And inside that fragment, preserved by some miracle of chemistry, there is DNA, degraded but readable, waiting for the right technology to come along. What will it tell us? What species does it belong to? What story is locked inside those ancient molecules? Maybe it is another Denisovan. Maybe it is one of those ghost lineages that shows up in the genetics, but has never been found in the physical record. Maybe it is something completely new. something that will force us to redraw the family tree one more time. The past is not fixed. It keeps changing as we learn how to ask better questions. The Neanderthals have been dead for 30,000 years and we're still figuring out who they were and who we are because of them. Because here is the thing that matters. The thing I want you to remember when you walk away from this. Every person with ancestry outside of Africa carries Neanderthal DNA. 1 to 4% of your genome depending on your background. That does not sound like much until you do the math. The human genome contains about 20,000 genes. 1% of that is 200 genes. 200 pieces of genetic code that came from a different species of human. That survived the end of their world and crossed the boundary between them and us, and persisted for 1,000 generations. Those genes are in your cells right now, wrapped in your chromosomes, getting copied every time your body makes new tissue. They have been passed down parent to child since the last Neanderthal walked the earth, an unbroken chain of inheritance stretching back 40,000 years. The Neanderthals did not really go extinct, not completely. They merged with us, got absorbed. Their species ended, but their genes survived inside a different species that kept going. That is not extinction. That is transformation. That is one story ending and another continuing with pieces of the old one woven into the new. You carry those pieces. Every single person listening to this carries some version of that legacy. The immune genes that help you fight infection, the variants that shape your brain, the ancient code that makes you slightly different from what you would be if the interbreeding had never happened. The Neanderthals hunted mammoths in the shadow of glaciers. They made fire 400,000 years ago. They wore bear skins and eagle talons and maybe painted caves and definitely buried their dead with something like love. And then they disappeared. But not entirely. Not forever. Because the last Neanderthal did not die in a cave in Gibraltar 30,000 years ago. The last Neanderthal is reading this right now. The last Neanderthal is you.